While Julian was calling the Meridian the future of the city in front of the cameras, I stood in the shadow of a concrete column and knew that every beam in that building was a documented crime. He pushed me into the basement by threatening my family's reputation. But he forgot one thing. I am the only person who knows exactly where the first crack will appear, the crack that will bury him along with his fake skyscraper. Before we continue and find out how it all began, please subscribe and leave a like. We'd truly love to read your comments below. The Meridian was supposed to be the culmination of 24 years of silence. I sat at my workstation on the 42nd floor of Vanguard Tower. The city looked like a circuit board I'd spent my life soldering together. At 48, my joints occasionally protested the 12-hour shifts, but my mind was as sharp as a diamond-tipped drill. I watched the dust motes dance in the late afternoon sun that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass. This was my world, a world of stress loads, cantilevered beams, and the quiet dignity of structures that refused to fall. I lived in the blueprints, finding peace in the mathematical certainty that a column of a specific density would support a specific weight without question. Unlike people, physics didn't lie. Unlike Julian Vane, a load-bearing wall didn't have an ego. I adjusted the sleeves of my charcoal sweater and looked at the render on my monitor. The Meridian was a triple-tower complex, a jagged glass crown that would redefine the skyline of downtown Chicago. It was my design. Every angle, every reinforced joint, every innovative seismic damper had been birthed in my head during 3 years in the Deep Lab. That was the windowless basement office where Julian kept his most valuable assets out of sight. I didn't mind the isolation back then. I thought it was a mark of trust. I thought being the ghost architect was a sacrifice I was making for the greater good of the firm. I was Elias Thorne, the man who made the impossible stand still. I believed that as long as the buildings were perfect, my name didn't need to be on the bronze plaque in the lobby. That was my first mistake. My second was trusting the procurement reports. It was 3 days ago, a Tuesday, when the air in my office started to feel too thin. I had been cross-referencing the foundation pouring logs with the original engineering specs for the South Tower. Something didn't click. The tensile strength of the rebar being used was grade 60, but my specs demanded grade 75. Those were the only specs that guaranteed the building wouldn't settle unevenly in the soft riverbank soil. A 15-point difference sounds small to a layman, but in a 40-story tower, it's the difference between a monument and a tomb. I dug deeper and accessed a hidden ledger on the firm's secure server. I used an old backdoor code Julian had given me years ago and likely forgotten. What I found wasn't a clerical error, it was a heist. $12 million had been diverted from the structural budget into administrative management fees. The specs had been downgraded to cover the hole. Julian wasn't building a skyscraper. He was building a financial life raft for Vanguard, and he was using my engineering as the hollow hull. I walked into Julian's office without knocking, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. He sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of black obsidian, looking every bit the visionary the magazines claimed he was. He was 60, silver-haired, and possessed a smile that felt like a warm bath until you realized the water was slowly coming to a boil. Across from him sat Kaylin Vance, a 28-year-old with a perfect tan, a $3,000 suit, and the architectural depth of a puddle. Kaylin was Julian's new favorite, the face of the Meridian project. He was the one Julian took to the gala dinners, the one who stood in front of the cameras with a hard hat and a winning grin. I said, my voice tight, "Julian, we have a problem." I dropped the printed procurement logs onto his obsidian desk. They looked like white wounds against the dark stone. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the papers. He leaned back, his chair creaking softly. he said, his tone dripping with the patronizing concern he'd used on me for a decade. Elias, you look tired. I thought you were taking the week to recalibrate. Kalen and I were discussing the marketing rollout for Phase 2. I ignored Kalen's presence. The South Tower is going to settle. The rebar is subspec. Someone swapped the grade 75 for grade 60 and pocketed the difference. If we don't halt the pour and replace the steel, the facade will start cracking within 18 months of completion. It's a structural disaster waiting to happen. Kalen let out a soft, melodic chuckle. Elias, always the doomsday prophet. I've looked at the reports. The margins are well within the safety parameters for the local zoning codes. You're over-engineering again. This isn't the Burj Khalifa, man. It's a commercial residential mix. I felt a flash of white-hot rage. I didn't design it to meet the bare minimum of a corrupt zoning board, Kalen. I designed it to stand for a century. Julian, look at the ledger. 12 million is missing. This isn't a mistake. It's fraud. Julian's smile didn't reach his eyes. His gaze turned cold, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. He stood up slowly, looming over the desk. Elias, let's be very clear about our roles here. You are a senior technical consultant. Your job is to provide the math that supports our vision. My job is to ensure this firm remains solvent and that our investors remain happy. The budget for the Meridian is my concern, not yours. I asked, my voice rising. And the safety? He said flatly. The safety is guaranteed by the certification I signed this morning. The project is on schedule. The IPO for Vanguard Structural is in 6 months, and the Meridian is our primary asset. I will not have you or your obsessive compulsion stalling our progress. You've spent too long in the basement, Elias. You've lost touch with the reality of how business is done in this country. He walked around the desk and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. It was meant to be fatherly, but it felt like a threat. Kalen is the lead architect on record for the Meridian. From this point forward, all technical queries go through him. You are to return to your office and finalize the cladding details. If I hear one more word about the foundation, I will consider it a breach of your non-disclosure agreement and a direct act of sabotage against the firm. Do I make myself clear? I looked at Kalen, who was watching me with a look of smug pity. He knew. He was in on it. Or at least he was happy to ride the wave of fraud as long as it kept him in the spotlight. I looked back at Julian. This was the man I had served for 20 years. The man whose reputation I had built with my own sweat and calculations. To him, I wasn't a partner. I wasn't even an architect. I was an appliance, a high-end calculator that he could unplug the moment it started giving him answers he didn't like. I whispered, "Well, clear." I walked out of the office, the glass doors clicking shut behind me like the gate of a prison. The hallway was lined with awards, most of them for projects I had designed and Julian had accepted the plaques for. I realized then that I was a ghost. I had spent my life building a house for a man who wanted me to die in the walls. I returned to my workstation, but I didn't open the cladding files. I sat in the dark as the office emptied, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my glasses. I opened a new encrypted drive. Julian thought he could erase me because he held the pen, but he forgot who designed the ink. He thought the grade 60 rebar was a secret, but I knew every weld, every tension point, every grain of concrete. I wasn't going to report him to the board. The board was probably on the payroll. I wasn't going to call the papers. They'd see a disgruntled employee. No, I was going to do what I do best. I was going to watch the structure. I was going to wait for the first crack to appear. And when the whole world looked to Vanguard for an answer, I would be the only one with the key to the tomb. The next morning, the humiliation was formalized. Julian called a global strategy meeting in the main atrium. 300 employees stood under the soaring glass ceiling as he stood on the podium, Kalen at his right hand. His voice boomed through the speakers. Today we enter a new era. The Meridian is our flagship, and under the brilliant leadership of our lead architect, Kalen Vance, we are ahead of schedule and under budget. I also want to thank our technical staff, including Elias Thorne, for their supportive work behind the scenes. A smattering of polite applause rippled through the room. Kalen smiled and waved, the golden boy in the sun. I stood at the very back, invisible against the shadow of a pillar. Supportive work. The phrase felt like a jagged blade in my gut. I had designed the nervous system of the building, and I was being thanked like the guy who stocks the vending machines. I felt a presence beside me. It was Sarah, a structural engineer I'd mentored for 5 years. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and sympathy. Elias, I saw the new foundation logs this morning. They changed your specs. I tried to say something to the project manager, but he told me to stay in my lane. What's going on? I looked at the podium at Julian and Kalen shaking hands for a photographer. I said, my voice devoid of emotion. The lane is changing, Sarah. Do your job. Document everything. Keep your personal logs on an external drive. Don't use the firm's server. She whispered, her brow furrowing. Why? I said, turning away from the celebration. Because when a building starts to fall, the only thing that matters is who can prove they tried to hold it up. I walked toward the elevators, leaving the applause behind. I didn't go to the basement. I went to the records room. Julian had revoked my administrative access to the live Meridian files, but he hadn't realized I'd already mirrored the entire server 2 days ago. I had the truth, I had the math, and now I had the motivation. Julian Vane wanted a ghost? Fine. I would be the kind of ghost that haunts a man until he starts praying for a priest. I would be the flaw in his foundation, the shadow in his IPO, and the silence at the end of his career. I spent the next 4 hours analyzing the settlement models. Using the inferior grade 60 rebar meant the lateral load capacity during high wind events was compromised by nearly 14%, a common occurrence in the Windy City. It wouldn't fall over tomorrow. It wouldn't even fall over next year. But in 5 years, when the building reached full occupancy and the winter gales hammered the glass facade, the vibrations would travel down to the foundation, meeting the unevenly settled concrete. The micro-fissures would start in the sub-basement. They would be invisible at first, hidden behind the high-end waterproof membranes Julian insisted on. But they would grow. Water from the Chicago River would seep in, corroding the steel that was already too weak for the job. It was a masterpiece of slow-motion catastrophe. I looked at my hands. They were steady. For 20 years I had used these hands to protect the firm. Now I would use them to archive its funeral. I began drafting a series of technical memorandums. I wrote them with clinical precision, detailing the exact risks of the rebar swap. I sent them to Julian's assistant, to the project manager, and to the head of procurement. I knew they would be ignored. I knew he had likely given them orders to delete anything with my name on it. That was the point. I needed a digital trail of ignored warnings. I needed to be the man who screamed into the void while the firm covered its ears. As I left the building that night, the security guard, an older man named Mike, who'd seen me come and go for a decade, nodded to me. "Late night again, Mr. Thorne? You're the heart of this place," I said, adjusting my scarf against the biting evening chill. "Not anymore, Mike. I'm a consultant now." The heart moved to the penthouse. I drove to my small apartment in Lincoln Park, a space filled with books on Greek architecture and boxes of old drafting tools. I made a pot of black coffee and sat at my kitchen table, opening my laptop. I didn't look at Vanguard's files. I looked at the legal requirements for whistleblower protection in the state of Illinois. I looked at the SEC regulations regarding IPO disclosures. Julian was planning to take the firm public on a lie. He was selling a vision of structural integrity while hiding a basement full of rot. I realized I couldn't be a victim. If I stayed silent, the cracks would be my fault too. But if I spoke now, Julian would crush me with a legion of high-priced lawyers before the first floor was even finished. No, I had to wait for the system to reach its tipping point. I had to wait until the weight of the Meridian became too much for him to carry. I leaned back, the steam from the coffee fogging my glasses. I wasn't an architect anymore. I was a structural analyst of a different kind. I was analyzing the structural integrity of Julian Vane's life, and I had already found the first crack. The following Monday, the temperature in Chicago plummeted to 12 degrees, and the wind off the lake felt like a serrated blade against any exposed skin. I arrived at Vanguard Tower at 7 in the morning, my breath hitching in the frigid air, only to find that my keycard didn't beep at the turnstile. It didn't turn red either. It remained dead, a piece of useless plastic in my numb hand. The lobby security guard, Mike, wouldn't look me in the eye. He stared at his monitor, his jaw tight. I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice, "Keycard's glitching, Mike." He finally looked up, and there was a flicker of genuine regret in his expression. "Orders from upstairs, Mr. Thorne. Your office has been relocated. You're to use the freight entrance on Lower Wacker." Lower Wacker Drive was the city's concrete underbelly, a subterranean labyrinth of exhaust fumes and shadows where the sun never reached. Moving an architect of my tenure, there wasn't a relocation. It was a burial. I didn't argue. I walked around the building, descending the stairs into the dim, orange-hued twilight of the lower roads. The freight entrance smelled of diesel and wet trash. A junior security guard I didn't recognize handed me a new badge. It didn't say Senior Technical Consultant, it said Archive Management. My new office was a windowless storage room adjacent to the building's HVAC plant. The roar of the industrial fans was a constant bone-shaking thrum that made conversation impossible. I sat in the vibrating darkness, the cold from the concrete floor seeping through the soles of my shoes. Julian wasn't sidelining me. He was trying to break my spirit, waiting for me to quit so he could trigger the non-compete clause and keep me unemployed for the next 2 years. He wanted me gone, but he wanted me silent more. I opened one of the boxes and found my old brass calipers, the ones my father had given me when I graduated from MIT. They were bent. It was a small, petty act of vandalism that told me everything I needed to know about Kalen's involvement in the move. I didn't let the anger take over. Instead, I plugged in the old monitor. As I expected, my access to the Meridian structural server was gone. I was restricted to the legacy archives, digitized blueprints of projects completed decades ago. But Julian had made a tactical error in his haste. He had cut off my access to the future, but he had left me in a room filled with the firm's physical past. I looked around the storage room. Thousands of rolls of vellum and blue-lined prints were stacked in disorganized heaps. These weren't old buildings. They were the financial DNA of Vanguard. I spent the morning archiving, which mostly involved searching for a way to fight back. Around noon, Sarah slipped through the heavy steel door. She looked pale, her eyes darting toward the security camera in the corner. She didn't say a word. She handed me a folded piece of paper and left. I waited 10 minutes, then unfolded the note in the shadow of the metal shelving. It was a screenshot of a project change order. Subject: seismic damper specs. The high-performance fluid viscous dampers I'd specified for the Meridian's upper floors had been replaced by standard friction plate dampers. It was another cost-cutting measure, another $12 million saved at the expense of the building's ability to sway during a storm. But there was something worse at the bottom of the page. The digital approval signature wasn't Julian's. It wasn't Kalen's. It was mine. A perfect cryptographic forgery of my professional seal had been used to authorize a change that could potentially snap the building's spine in a 100-year wind. The room felt like it was spinning. This was the cost of Julian's IPO. He wasn't stealing money. He was stealing my professional life to indemnify himself. If the Meridian ever failed, the paper trail would lead directly to this vibrating basement room. I was being set up as the fall guy for a disaster that hadn't happened yet. I realized then that my archive management role was a cage designed to keep me close enough to frame, but far enough to silence. I reached for my phone to call Marcus, an old contact at the Department of Buildings, but I hesitated. In this city, the DOB wasn't a sanctuary. It was a marketplace. Julian sat on half a dozen civic boards. He donated to the mayor's re-election fund. If I moved too early, the irregularities in my files would be reported before I could explain them. I needed an outside leverage point. I decided to meet Marcus anyway. Waiting any longer would only tighten the trap around me. We met at an old-school diner under the L tracks in the Loop, the kind of place where the grease on the walls was older than the skyscrapers outside. Marcus was a man who lived in the fine print of city codes, a career civil servant who looked like he hadn't slept since the Great Fire. He looked at the change order I'd printed out, his eyes widening behind thick yellowed lenses. He whispered, the sound of a passing train rattling the sugar shakers on our table. "Elias, this is heavy. Grade 60 steel and friction dampers in a tower that height? It's a violation of the 2019 code updates, but the certification is already through. I saw the stamp on the digital permit yesterday," I said, leaning in. "I didn't sign it, Marcus. They forged my seal." Marcus looked away, staring into his black coffee. "It doesn't matter, Elias, not in this town. Julian's firm is the centerpiece of the new development zone. The city needs that IPO to succeed because Vanguard is promising a $500 million tax base over the next decade. If I flag this, my boss will bury it, and I'll be directing traffic at O'Hare by Friday." I asked, "So what? We let them build a death trap?" Marcus finally looked at me, and I saw a deep, pervasive fear in his eyes. "You don't understand how deep the water is, Elias. Julian didn't buy the inspectors, he bought the narrative. The Meridian is the future of Chicago. You can't fight the future with a stolen change order. You need something that hits the money. Investors don't care about rebar, but they care about liability. If you can prove that the fraud is systemic, that it's not one building but the entire firm's valuation that's built on sand, then you might have a shot. But Elias, be careful. Men like Julian don't fire people. They erase them." I walked back to Vanguard Tower through the wind, the reality of my situation settling in like ice. I was alone. My mentee was terrified, my city contact was compromised, and my boss had stolen my identity to cover his crimes. When I reached the freight entrance, Kalen was waiting for me. He was leaning against the steel door frame, a designer coat draped over his shoulders, looking out of place. He asked, his voice smooth and mocking, "How was the L ride, Elias? I saw you leaving. You really shouldn't wander off during work hours. Archive management is a demanding role," I said, stepping close enough to see the pores in his skin. "You forged my signature, Kalen. That's a felony. In this state, it's 10 years per instance." While Julian was calling the Meridian the future of the city in front of the cameras, I stood in the shadow of a concrete column and knew that every beam in that building was a documented crime. He pushed me into the basement by threatening my family's reputation. But he forgot one thing. I am the only person who knows exactly where the first crack will appear, the crack that will bury him along with his fake skyscraper. Before we continue and find out how it all began, please subscribe and leave a like. We'd truly love to read your comments below. Kalen didn't even blink. He smiled, a bright, empty flash of white teeth. "Forgeries are so hard to prove when the person's workstation has been flagged. It looks a lot like you were trying to manipulate the specs to cover for your own mistakes. Julian is being very kind by not involving the police yet. He thinks you're having a nervous breakdown." He reached out and patted my cheek. a gesture so condescending it made my vision blur. "Enjoy the basement, Elias. It's where ghosts belong. And don't worry about the meridian. I've refined the design. It's much more efficient now." I watched him walk away. The pressure was mounting, a crushing weight that felt like the atmosphere of a deep-sea trench. Every move I made was being anticipated. Julian was playing a game of structural integrity, and he had already compromised my pillars. I spent the next 3 days in the HVAC room, the constant drone of the fans becoming a part of my own heartbeat. I realized I couldn't fight from the outside. I had to go deeper into the archives. If Julian was stealing money from the Meridian, he had been stealing it from other projects too. A fraud of this magnitude doesn't start with a skyscraper. It starts with a parking garage, a library, a small-scale renovation. It's a habit. I began a systematic audit of the physical blueprints in the storage room. I looked for the small things, the discrepancies between the original hand-drafted designs and the final as-built digital records. I worked by the light of a small LED pen light, my fingers stained with blue ink and decades-old dust. On Thursday night, I found it. It was a project from 8 years ago, the St. Jude Community Center. It was a modest building, a charity project Julian had used for massive PR. The physical blueprints showed a reinforced concrete roof designed to hold a garden. The digital records showed the garden had been built. But the delivery receipts for the structural steel didn't match the load requirements. Julian had billed the charity for the garden-ready roof but had actually installed a standard lightweight frame. He'd pocketed the difference from a non-profit. It was a pattern. I found 3 more instances over the next 12 hours. A bridge overpass with subgrade pilings, a school auditorium with downgraded fireproofing. Julian wasn't a cheat. He was a scavenger. But the cost of my discovery was becoming clear. On Friday morning, I found Sarah crying in the hallway near the freight elevators. She wouldn't look at me. She whispered, her voice trembling, "I'm sorry, Elias. They told me that if I spoke to you again, they'd pull my sponsorship for my professional license. Kaylin told everyone that you've been stealing firm secrets to sell to the competition. Nobody believes it, but everyone's afraid." I realized then the true genius of Julian's pressure. He wasn't isolating me. He was making me toxic. He was turning my legacy into a biohazard, ensuring that even if I survived, I would have nothing left to return to. My reputation, the only thing I had spent 48 years building, was being dismantled piece by piece. I returned to my table in the basement. The vibration of the HVAC plant felt like it was rattling my very teeth. I looked at the old monitor. I had the physical proof of a decade of fraud, but I was a man accused of treason in the only world I knew. I was a ghost haunted by the living. I sat there in the orange twilight, the weight of the building above me feeling like it was pressing down directly on my chest. Julian Vane was ascending to the clouds on a pedestal of stolen steel and forged names, and I was buried in the exhaust. I thought about the first crack I'd predicted in the Meridian. I realized I couldn't wait 5 years for the building to fail. If I did, Julian would be on a beach in the Mediterranean, the IPO money long laundered, and Sarah and I would be the ones answering the subpoenas. I had to accelerate the timeline. I had to find a way to make the cracks visible now while the cement was still wet. I reached into my box and pulled out my bent brass calipers. I straightened them slowly, the metal resisting before snapping back into place. Julian thought I was a ghost. He thought I was a component of his firm that he could swap out for a cheaper version. But he forgot the most basic rule of architecture. The most dangerous part of a building isn't the part that's under stress. It's the part that's been ignored until it's too late to fix. I opened my encrypted drive and began to map out Vanguard's financial foundation. I wasn't looking for cracks in the concrete anymore. I was looking for the one point of failure that would bring the whole tower screaming down. I began to write an anonymous letter, not to the city but to the primary underwriter of Vanguard's IPO, a firm in New York called Blackwood Securities. I didn't mention safety. I didn't mention forged signatures. I simply attached the procurement logs from St. Jude and the Meridian and asked a single devastating question. If Vanguard is saving $24 million on steel, where is that money on your balance sheet? I sent the email from an encrypted relay at 3 in the morning on Saturday. As I walked out of the freight entrance and looked up at the darkened glass of Vanguard Tower, I felt a strange, cold peace. The pressure was no longer on me. It was now a structural reality for everyone. I had made my first move, and in the silence of the Chicago night, I could almost hear the first microscopic fissure beginning to spread through the obsidian heart of Julian Vane's empire. I was no longer a ghost. I was the weight that would eventually break the scale. The fallout from the Blackwood Securities email arrived on Tuesday afternoon, but it didn't come with the sirens or the handcuffs I had envisioned. Instead, it arrived in the form of 4 men in charcoal suits who didn't look like investigators. They looked like pallbearers. They were a forensic audit team from a third-party firm, and for a fleeting, delusional hour, I sat in my vibrating basement room thinking I had won. I thought the gears of corporate justice were finally turning. Then Julian Vane walked into the storage room. He wasn't shouting. He didn't look panicked. He looked disappointed, the way a father looks at a child who has finally outgrown his usefulness. He walked to my metal table and placed a thick leather-bound folder on top of my bent calipers. He said, his voice low, almost melodic, cutting through the roar of the HVAC fans. "Elias, we need to talk about your father." I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. My father had been Julian's first partner, a man of uncompromising ethics. He had died in a car accident when I was 22. Julian had been the one to pay for my final year at MIT. He had been the one to give me my first drafting table. I said, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. "My father has nothing to do with the Meridian." Julian opened the folder. Inside were old, yellowed blueprints for the St. Jude Community Center, the same project I'd found in the archives. But these weren't the ones I'd seen. These were the originals, signed in my father's precise architectural hand. He said, "Your father didn't design St. Jude, Elias. He miscalculated the load-bearing capacity of the roof during a massive blizzard in '98. The structure started to fail before the garden was even installed. He came to me terrified. He knew that a failure of that scale would end him, would strip him of his license, would leave you with nothing but his debt. So I fixed it. I altered the records, I swapped the materials, and I took the risk. I saved his name. And in return, I asked for one thing, his silence, and later yours." I stared at the blueprints, the blue ink blurring before my eyes. My entire professional foundation, my belief in my father's integrity, the very reason I had become an architect, was a fabrication. I hadn't been Julian's protege. I had been his collateral. I was a 20-year investment in a debt I didn't even know I owed. Julian leaned in, the smell of his expensive tobacco cloying in the small room. "The auditors you see upstairs, they aren't here for me, Elias. They're here because of the erratic warnings I've been filing about your mental state for months. They're looking at the Meridian specs, and they're finding your forged signature on every cost-cutting measure. They're seeing a man who, in a fit of psychological instability, tried to sabotage his own project and then tried to blackmail the firm with fabricated procurement logs. I told them about your father, too. I told them that the trauma of his secret has finally broken you. They believe me, Elias, because I have the paper trail and you have a history of being invisible." He stood up, looking around the grimy storage room with an air of finality. "Sarah has been promoted to senior technical consultant. She signed the final safety certification for the foundation an hour ago. She's a smart girl. She understands that in this industry the building stands because we say it stands. She's the new heart of Vanguard, Elias. You're the ghost of a dead man's mistake. The crushing weight of his words felt like a building collapse. I realized the trap Julian had set wasn't professional. It was ancestral. He had spent decades ensuring that if I ever turned on him, I would have to destroy the memory of the only person I ever loved. I was isolated in a way that defied physics. My name was being used to cover his crimes, my mentor was a predator, and my mentee had been forced to become my replacement. Julian walked to the door, stopping with his hand on the heavy steel handle. You're fired, Elias. Effective immediately. For cause. Your pension is voided, your medical benefits are terminated, and I've already contacted the AIA. Your license is being suspended pending a formal ethics investigation. Don't bother going back to your workstation. Security has already cleared it. Mike is waiting for you in the alley. He left, the door clicking shut with a finality that felt like a coffin lid. I sat in the darkness, the hum of the fans now sounding like a choir of mocking voices. I had reached the center of the labyrinth only to find myself. I was the one who had built the walls around myself. I didn't move for a long time. I couldn't. I felt a profound hollow emptiness, a moral breakage that left me paralyzed. Everything I had built, every structure I had ever designed felt tainted. I wasn't an architect. I was a co-conspirator in a lie that spanned generations. When I finally walked out of the freight entrance, the Chicago winter hit me with a ferocity that made my lungs ache. Mike was there, standing in the gray slush of Lower Wacker. He held a single box. He didn't say a word as he handed it to me. He looked at the ground, his eyes red. He knew. Everyone knew the story Julian had told. I was the rogue employee, the crazy man, the saboteur. I took the box and walked toward the light at the end of the tunnel, my footsteps sounding hollow against the concrete. As I emerged onto the street, I saw a giant digital billboard across from the river. It was an advertisement for Vanguard's IPO. Strength you can trust, the tagline read, superimposed over a gleaming render of the Meridian. I stood on the corner, a 48-year-old man with no job, no reputation, and a box of broken drafting tools, watching the city celebrate the man who had erased him. I walked to the riverfront, the wind whipping my coat open. I looked down at the dark, icy water. I thought about jumping. I thought about the peace of the silt and the silence of the deep. But then I looked up at the skeletal frame of the Meridian rising into the gray sky. I could see the cranes, the tiny figures of workers moving like ants over the steel. And I remembered the math. Julian could forge my signature, he could lie about my father, he could convince the world I was insane, but he couldn't change the laws of physics. Grade 60 rebar in a grade 75 structure. Friction dampers in a fluid viscosity zone. The building didn't care about Julian's IPO. It didn't care about my father's secrets. It only cared about the gravity and the wind. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. I was going to do something much more difficult. I was going to live long enough to see the Meridian fail. I walked away from the river, leaving the box of tools on a park bench. I didn't need them anymore. I didn't need a drafting table or a license. I needed to be a ghost, a real one. I spent the next 48 hours in a haze of cold and caffeine. I moved out of my apartment. I couldn't afford the rent anyway. I took a room in a derelict residential hotel on the edge of the West Loop, a place where the walls were thin and the residents didn't ask for your resume. I spent my last few $100s on a high-end burner phone and a portable hard drive. I sat on the sagging bed, the smell of old grease and cheap detergent filling the room, and I opened the files I had mirrored from Vanguard's server. I looked at the Meridian's final as-built designs, the ones Sarah had certified. My stomach turned. They hadn't only downgraded the rebar. To meet the aggressive IPO timeline, Julian had authorized a continuous pour method for the core. The concrete wasn't being given the proper time to cure between levels. In the summer heat, it might have worked. But in the Chicago winter, with the fluctuating temperatures and the moisture from the river, the core was becoming brittle. The future of Chicago was a giant vertical stick of chalk. I realized Julian wasn't a scavenger. He was a nihilist. He didn't care if the building fell in 10 years. He only cared if it stayed up for 6 months, long enough for him to cash out. I looked at the render on my phone. The meridian looked like a crown, but I saw it for what it really was. A guillotine. And then I saw the names of the tenants who had already signed pre-leases for the penthouse floors. Major banks, tech giants, high-end law firms. Thousands of people would be moving into that guillotine in less than a year. The hollow emptiness I'd felt in the basement shifted into something else. It shifted into a cold, predatory resolve. Julian Vane had used my father's mistake to cage me. He had used my loyalty to frame me. He had used my silence to build a monument to his own greed. I stood up and walked to the window. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. I could see the distant lights of the skyline, the towers glowing like embers. I wasn't an architect anymore. I was a demolition expert. I wasn't going to fix the meridian. I was going to ensure that when it failed publicly. I was going to make sure Julian Vane wouldn't lose his money. He would lose his freedom. I realized I couldn't stop the building from being built. It was already too far gone. The concrete was poured. The steel was set. The lie was structural. I took a deep breath, the air in the hotel room tasting of dust and stale hope. I reached for my burner phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It was a man named Miller, a retired investigative journalist for the Tribune. He had spent his career uncovering corruption in Chicago's construction unions before the papers stopped caring. I said, my voice sounding like gravel. Miller? It's Elias Thorne. I have a story for you. It's about a building that's already dead, and the man who's trying to sell the wake as a wedding. Miller's voice crackled through the speaker. Elias, I heard you lost your mind. The word on the street is you're a saboteur. Why should I listen to you? I said, staring at the distant silhouette of the meridian. Because I have the math, Miller. And physics doesn't have a PR department. Julian Vane is building a tomb, and he's using my father's name as the headstone. I'm going to give you everything. The forged signatures, the procurement logs, the seismic data. But I need you to wait. I need you to wait until the IPO roadshow starts. I want the world to be watching when the first crack appears. He asked, and what about you, Elias? You know this ruins you too. If you were the one who signed those change orders, you're going to jail right next to him, I said, looking at the peeling wallpaper of my room. I'm already in jail, Miller. I've been in a basement for 20 years. A cell will be a change of scenery. Tell me you'll do it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Miller's heavy breathing. Send me the first file, Elias. Let's see. I hung up and began the upload. I was a man with nothing left to lose, which meant I was finally the most dangerous structural element Julian Vane had ever encountered. The meridian was rising floor by floor, a monument to a lie. But in the shadows of the West Loop, the truth was beginning to cure. And unlike Julian's concrete, the truth was going to be unbreakable. I sat back on the bed, the blue light of the phone screen illuminating my face. The lowest point was behind me. Now there was only the descent, and I was going to make sure Julian Vane was the first one to hit the ground.